Space around Seravel Station looked like a bruise that refused to heal. The star at the center of the Seravel Corridor burned wan and crooked behind layered veils of dust. Broken hulls drifted where trade routes had once been. Tugs shoved refugee barges through traffic lanes so crowded that collision alarms screamed more often than they fell silent. In the station's central hall, families slept under flickering holoads for credits they did not have, in languages they no longer trusted. The Aurelic Assembly considered the region stabilized. There were fences now, and forms to fill. In one of the observation galleries, a school of Rillan children pressed their translucent faces against the glass, watching the wreckage float past. Their skin shimmered in muted blues, patterns of stress pulsing down their spines. Scholar Velru stood a few steps behind them, tall and long-limbed, even by Rillan standards, gill slits fluttering in the station's recycled air. Velru was old enough to remember oceans and the sensation of real currents. Sometimes, looking out at the traffic, the scholar imagined they were standing on the seabed of a world that had dried up, watching skeletons of ships dragged along the bottom. "Is that one going to the water?" a child asked, pointing at a transport whose markings had been painted over so many times that only ghosts of flags remained. "There is no water here," Velru answered. "Only air and metal, but perhaps it will go somewhere with sky." "Earth?" another child asked, hopeful. "Mother says Earth still lets people land." Velru did not answer. The scholar's throat tightened in the dry air. Rumors traveled faster than ships, and not all of them arrived intact. Far away, beyond the soot-stained light of the corridor, a different assembly was coming to its own decision. The Aurelic Assembly's chamber was a bowl of stone and light, grown from composite crystal hundreds of meters thick. Delegates from 100 star systems floated or stood in their alcoves. The air smelled of sterilized water, electronic ozone, and the faint traces of too many atmospheres processed into something bland enough to offend no one. At the center of the bowl, under a lattice of holo-displays, Speaker Janur watched the last of the voting glyphs solidify. The tall, silver-skinned presiding officer did not visibly react. Inside, Janur felt the weight of a pivot that could not be undone. "By the tally of present members," Janur announced, "the emergency amendment is adopted, pending review. The planet known as Earth is prohibited from accepting additional displaced persons from the Seravel Corridor, or from any region designated as comparably unstable, until the Assembly concludes its investigation." The statement spread out through the chamber and into the networks beyond, translated into thousands of languages in a fraction of a second. Galaxies away, news anchors straightened in their chairs. Algorithmic feeds reshuffled priorities. Data brokers opened new files. In the Zhakari Dominion's reserved alcove, Prefect Maljour permitted a slow exhalation, the satisfaction carefully hidden behind a practiced mask. The Zhakari official was slight, wrapped in layered crimson garments whose nanofibers tracked every shift of posture. Maljour's compound eyes reflected the scrolling of new headlines circling the chamber. At the far side, in the Celsorian delegation zone, Envoy Loreth's fingers pressed together in a gesture of private unease. Celsorians, feathered and luminous in pale greens, disliked abrupt changes in policy. They liked them even less when driven by fear. Loreth's private slate flickered with metrics. Earth, resettlement numbers off the chart. Social cohesion indices volatile but trending upward. Technological innovations surging in migrant-heavy districts. Crime no worse than baseline. Cultural exports multiplying. It was messy, yes, but the details told a story that the ban ignored. Across the chamber, whoever served the interests of fear had won the day. Speaker Janur's thoughts lingered a moment on a brief from Earth that had arrived too late to matter. A request for additional transports. A warning about life support on Seravel Station. A quiet offer of Earth-based engineers to upgrade failing systems without asking for more resettlement rights in return. Janur filed the thought away. The Assembly had spoken. Procedure must follow. On a spinning ring of steel and glass wrapped around the blue-white planet called Earth, comm channels burst into overlapping cries. The Tethys habitat ring straddled the boundary between atmosphere and vacuum. From a distance, it looked like a thin halo, Up close, it was a city the size of a continent, stitched together from shipyards, research platforms, and residential blocks. In a conference chamber windowed on both sides, space on one, Earth's curve on the other, Secretary General Aiden Kwan stood very still as the legal summary scrolled along the wall. Dark hair, cut short, shoulders squared. Aiden wore the aging fatigue of a man who had watched hope and disaster alternate often enough to stop confusing one for the other. His expression revealed little. Inside, anger coiled and uncoiled with disciplined precision. "So that's it?" Mayor Camila Duarte demanded. Her voice ricocheted off polished surfaces. "They signed it? Just like that?" "They signed it," Aiden said. Camila's reflection glared back at her from the glass. New Recif's mayor carried the humidity of a coastal megacity in the way she moved, hands describing wide arcs. Her city's skyline had been plastered across the networks as a symbol of reckless hospitality. Towers retrofitted to accommodate species that breathe different mixes. Rooftops flowing into terraces of algae, ponds, and alien architecture. Dr. Naila Ezenwa, sitting at the long table, tapped through paragraphs of the amendment with long, quick fingers. Integration specialist, migration scholar, and one of the architects of Earth's wildest policies, she had the air of a woman whose mind raced 2 steps ahead of her mouth. "It's not retroactive," Naila said. "Everyone already admitted stays. But from this moment, we're frozen. No new arrivals, no new family reunifications, no expansion from the corridor or anywhere like it." Commander Tomasz Wrona leaned back, arms folded across a chest marked by scars that ran deeper than the visible ones. Representing Earth's defense and security interests, he measured everything in risk units like other people measured distance. "How many are in pipeline?" he asked quietly. Rajiv Menon, data architect of the Atlas Protocol, flicked his wrist. The invisible assistant routed a chart to the wall. "Formally registered and cleared. Waiting on transport?" Rajiv said. "About 2.6 million, informally tracked. In camps and stations where they've filled out intent forms with local advocates, closer to 9.3 million. Corridor only." Aiden's jaw tightened. "Seravel Station?" Rajiv zoomed in. The diagram of the corridor bloomed, showing dots clustering thick around the central station. "Station capacities at 140% of design, give or take," Rajiv said. "Unofficially, because no one wants to admit it. Their life support metrics are trending badly. One power relay failure away from a very ugly headline." "And now, no one can leave for here," Camila said. She sank back into her chair. "We've been promising them for months that the transports were just waiting on dock maintenance." "We promised them our intentions," Aiden said. "The Assembly has promised them a holding pattern." He paused, letting the anger cool into something he could use. "We cannot," he said, "leave them there." Wrona's practical mind drew immediate lines between that statement and the enemies it could make. "If we defy the ban, we invite sanctions. Maybe blockade. Maybe worse. You've seen the Zhakari projections. They think we're rewriting galactic culture by accident. They're not going to ignore an excuse to push back." "If we obey," Naila said, "we're complicit in letting millions rot in orbit because it's more comfortable to pretend they're in processing." "I've read the same projections, Commander. Stasis breeds instability faster than any migration event." Rajiv's thoughts flickered between empathy and models. He saw graphs in his mind's eye, lines going up and down, thresholds crossed. "What if?" he murmured, half to himself. "We're asking the wrong question." Camila snorted. "We asked for permission. We gotta know. What other question is there?" Rajiv's eyes tracked mental search results. Rules, exceptions, definitions. "The ban," he said slowly, "names displaced persons, refugees, asylum seekers, stateless individuals. It specifies relocation, resettlement, emergency transit. It doesn't touch educational visas or cultural exchange frameworks. Those are all in a different treaty." Naila's head snapped up. "The Refugee Resettlement Accord is separate from the Education and Cultural Exchange Protocols," she said. "I helped draft Earth's annex to those. They assumed exchanges would be small, elite, symbolic. No upper limits, because no one imagined." That anyone would be stupid or desperate enough to push that clause to its breaking point. Wrona finished, one eyebrow lifting. Camila stared between them. Explain like I'm a municipal administrator who's had 3 hours of sleep. Nyla turned the wall display into a cascade of cross-linked articles. Words blinked in and out, key phrases highlighted. If an individual is admitted under an accredited educational program, she said, they are not categorized as a refugee even if they are displaced. They have different protections, different obligations. The Assembly can regulate refugee flows. But education is governed under a different logic. Exchange is sacrosanct. It's about mutual enrichment, not unilateral burden. Educational programs usually mean a few hundred elite students moving between core worlds, Rajiv added. Summer academies, cultural residencies, nothing that would scare anyone. And if, Aiden asked, voice gone very calm, Earth's educational institutions extended admission to, say, millions of displaced individuals from the corridor and beyond? If we certified programs designed to give them the skills they need to rebuild their worlds or integrate elsewhere, if we said, you are not beggars at our gate, you are enrollees in a global and now interstellar campus, Camila's mind leaped forward from that image. Her city as lecture hall and dormitory. Her overcrowded housing suddenly becoming student towers, not camps. We would be accused, she said slowly, of playing word games. We would be accused, Nyla corrected, of respecting the letter of the law the Assembly itself wrote. Refugees relocated to Earth? Banned. Exchange participants temporarily relocated under certified educational tracks? Unregulated. Their legal status changes. Our obligations to them do not. Wrona saw it then, as clearly as he had ever seen a tactical map. You'll enrage the Zhakari, he said. You'll rattle every conservative bloc in that chamber. They already think we're too willing to host anyone who asks. Aiden looked out through the window to where the curve of Earth glowed against black. They think we cannot be trusted with the architecture of the galaxy's conscience, he said. Perhaps they are right to be wary. We remake things when we touch them. But if we leave those people in limbo to preserve the Assembly's sense of order, what are we? He turned back. Eyes moved from face to face. All right, draft it, design it, price it. Tell me what it will take to turn Earth into what the galaxy forgot a world could be. A place where you go not just to survive, but to learn how to live again. Rajiv's heart beat faster, sensing a problem big enough to match his ambition. Nyla's mind burned with outlines. Camila's worries spread out like maps. Wrona's mental defense grids lit up with red points, representing all the ways this could go wrong. Sahar al-Hadid, who had been standing quietly by the door, a tablet hugged to her chest, felt something different. The engineering student had come as an observer from New Recife, part of a mentorship program between city and orbital governance. She had expected to take notes, fetch coffee, and brag afterward about being in the room. Instead, she watched history pivot and thought, someone is going to need to build interfaces fast enough to hold this together. Someone is going to have to talk with the people already waiting. Someone is going to have to explain all this in words that don't sound like policy. Sahar's fingers tightened around the tablet. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. The decision was already rolling forward. In the days that followed, Earth's networks filled with a new phrase, Panstellar Exchange Initiative. What it meant at first was confusion. On the Tethys habitat ring, entire sectors were reclassified as campus zones overnight. Abandoned shipyards sprouted scaffolds for lecture halls and modular labs. Architects cursed at regulations that had never anticipated multi-species dormitories. On Earth's surface, universities and technical institutes received messages from the United Earth Assembly. You are hereby invited to design courses for an influx of students from the Seravel Corridor. Expect participants who have lost their homes, their documents, sometimes their families. Expect languages our translation algorithms barely recognize. Expect trauma in every classroom. Some administrators panicked. Others saw opportunity. Most assumed it was rhetorical, political theater that would never reach their front gates. The Atlas Protocol did not assume. Rajiv's sprawling network of logistics algorithms and social modeling had been built to track and match refugees to communities. With a heave, he began refactoring it into something new. "We're not assigning people to camps," he told his exhausted team during a late-night session where empty energy drink containers formed more stable structures than some of their prototype code. "We're placing them in curriculums, peer networks, mentorship webs. We're not asking where can they fit. We're asking what can they learn, what can they teach, and who needs that around them." Sahar, who had somehow been promoted from observant student to junior systems engineer in the space of a week, rewired interface flows to show prospective participants not as case numbers, but as potential classmates. She recorded guidelines for human host communities in plain speech. People clicked because she sounded like somebody's older cousin explaining a complicated game, not a bureaucrat. The Soul-Born Solidarity Network, which had started as a loose grassroots coalition of volunteers helping newcomers find their way around cities, suddenly received official blessing and a fire hose of data. "You want to what?" one of their coordinators had asked. When Earth's Assembly liaison proposed folding them into the Panstellar Exchange Initiative's mentoring schema, recruit and train millions of volunteer tutors, language partners, host families, the liaison answered, "We'll give you matching tools and support. You give us the human piece." The coordinator had laughed, then realized the other person was not joking. The network lit up with messages. People who had never set foot in a refugee resettlement center signed up, comforted by the new label, not crisis workers, but host mentors. Labels mattered more than the exhausted policymakers in Tethys's conference rooms liked to admit. The Aurelic Assembly noticed. When Aiden Kwan's face filled the central chamber's main display, some delegates leaned forward, others leaned back, and a few muted their feeds to roll their eyes without consequence. "Honored members of the Assembly," Aiden began, voice steady. "Earth acknowledges and respects the emergency amendment passed regarding displaced persons. We will comply fully with its restrictions on refugee resettlement." A murmur of something like disappointment moved through some blocks. It pleased others. "What we cannot comply with," Aiden continued, "is a universe in which people are forced to stagnate in limbo because our categories cannot imagine anything between guest and burden. So we offer you something else." Data bloomed beside his image. Schematic and fluid. Under the Education and Cultural Exchange Protocols, every member world retains the right to invite students and visiting instructors. The protocols specify no numerical limit, no origin restrictions. In the spirit of those protocols, Earth's institutions are launching a comprehensive educational program aimed at citizens of the Seravel Corridor and similarly affected regions. The phrase citizens was deliberate. It landed differently than victims or displaced persons. "We are not taking more refugees," Aiden said. "We are accepting students. We are enrolling guest instructors. They will be granted temporary exchange status under existing law. We will teach them what we know, and we will ask them to teach us what they know. We will equip as many as we can to return and rebuild, or to integrate wherever they are welcomed next." In the Zhakari alcove, Prefect Maljour's lips pressed thin. "This is a semantic evasion," Maljour hissed to a subordinate, knowing full well the microphones were live. "He thinks he can bypass our decision by renaming the flood." On the open channel, the prefect said, in smoother tones, "Secretary General Kwan, do you seriously expect us to believe that your world can fully integrate, educate, and host millions of displaced beings as students without producing the same culture shock and destabilization your current resettlement numbers already generate?" Aiden inclined his head. "I expect you to believe what you see," he said. "We invite Assembly monitors to audit our programs in real time. We will make our integration tools publicly available. If you fear that we are wielding chaos, then come study the pattern." Envoy Lurith pressed a winged hand to the speaking node. "The Celsorian Commonwealth acknowledges Earth's legal argument," Lurith said. "We also acknowledge that education has historically been one of the most stable forms of exchange. We propose a provisional period, with monitoring. Let Earth test their hypothesis under the Assembly's eye." Speaker Janur listened, mind running through alternate futures. The letter of the Accords, the political reality, the image of Seravel Station's metrics flashing red in a classified report. Provisional authorization is granted, Janur concluded. Earth may proceed with their exchange initiative under strict oversight. A review board will be appointed. The board will have full access to Earth's data related to the program. The decision was a compromise, as all great shifts in policy tended to be. It gave everyone something to claim. It also opened a door. On Seravel Station, the first of Earth's envoys arrived with promises printed on hardlight. The ISS Dauntless Horizon eased into dock with thrusters whispering. A ship built at the ragged edge of Earth's post-contact industrial boom, it wore its purpose plainly. Modular cargo bays, expanded medical wards, whole decks, reconfigurable as classrooms or field hospitals. In one such makeshift auditorium, Sahar stood in front of rows of Rillan and other corridor refugees, a translator node clipped to her collar. The air smelled of coolant, overcooked nutrient paste, and tired bodies. They watched her with a look she recognized from public lectures in New Recife's poorer districts. Wary hope, ready to tip into contempt if she sounded like she was selling something she would never have to use herself. Behind her, a projection of Earth hung in the stale air. "I'm not here to tell you things are fine," Sahar said. "They're not. You shouldn't be stuck on this station at all. You should be at home, or somewhere that isn't collapsing under its own statistics. But until that exists, we have another option." Holo panels flared into life, showing dormitories on the Tethys habitat ring, transformed common rooms in New Recife, laboratories still under construction, and classrooms where humans and aliens sat together. "We can't take you as refugees," Sahar said. "That door is blocked for now. The law says we can't bring more displaced people to Earth just to live. But the law also says we can invite as many of you as we can teach." Murmurs rippled through the hall. The translator lagged a heartbeat behind her words, stacking multiple languages in staggered echoes. "We are opening programs in engineering, medicine, infrastructure repair, governance, counseling, cultural preservation, everything we can think of that might help you rebuild your worlds or carve out more stable lives wherever you land," she continued. "We're also opening space for you to teach your histories, your technologies, your art, your survival methods." A tall Rillan rose in the third row, Velru. The scholar's gaze was sharp, shimmering patterns on their skin cycling in skeptical lines. "You call us students," Velru said, "but will our time with you be recorded as asylum, as relocation? Will your assembly count us as guests, or will they decide later that we were merely refugees under another name?" Sahar had anticipated the question. She had also felt, in late-night panic, the weight of how fragile the answer was. "Your status under interstellar law will be exchange participant," she said. "You will have student visas, co-signed by Earth and by the institutions that accept you. If you graduate and choose to stay, we will fight for your right to regularize that status. If you choose to return or move on, your qualifications will travel with you. And if the Assembly decides to close this loophole," Velru pressed, "if they declare later that you abused their trust, then that will be on us," Sahar said. Her heart hammered, but her voice did not waver. "We are the ones stretching their categories. We'll take the blame. That is our risk. Your risk is this. You step onto those ships. You trust us to teach you something worth the voyage. And you trust that you won't be treated like cargo." She hesitated, then reached for something beyond policy. "When my grandparents moved from their village to New Recife, locals called them squatters," she said. "They lived in unfinished buildings and were told they didn't belong. The only people who treated them as more than statistics were the teachers who let them into classrooms, as if that were the most natural thing in the world. Education wasn't a luxury. It was how they proved, even to themselves, that they were more than where they slept. We can argue about law forever. I'm asking you, do you want to spend the next decade waiting in line, or do you want to spend it learning how to make sure your grandchildren don't?" Silence held for several breaths. Velru's thoughts turned inward, to flooded biolibraries and lost apprentices. to lectures delivered in rooms that now floated as ash in space. The scholar wondered if pride was a luxury species facing slow erasure could still afford. "Will there be Rillan instructors?" Velru asked. "If you volunteer," Sahar said. "And if you don't, we'll still spend our time pestering you with questions until you teach us something." A faint ripple of amusement spread through the hall. The smallest child from the observation gallery raised both webbed hands. "If we go," the child asked, "do we have to come back?" "You won't have to do anything you don't choose," Sahar said. "But I hope many of you will want to, not because we send you away, but because you have something to rebuild out there." The first wave of digital acceptance notices went out within hours. On battered terminals and repurposed comm panels, names appeared next to program titles: Environmental Systems Design, Trauma-Informed Governance, Cross-Species Medicine, Community Engineering. The screens showed institution seals from Tethys-based universities and Earth's surface schools. Velru's name appeared alongside Historical Resilience and Cultural Reconstruction, Visiting Scholar Track. The scholar stared at it for a long time. Somewhere beyond the walls, pressure gradients shifted as docking clamps released. The transports that left Seravel Station that week were not called refugee ships in the logs. Their manifests listed exchange participants and guest instructors. The difference was paper-thin and steel-hard at the same time. The transition was not graceful. When the first convoys reached Tethys habitat rings hastily converted campus sectors, workers were still bolting down seating in lecture halls. Housing pods arrived on tugs as their assigned residents came off the shuttles, bags in their hands. In the Rillan Refuge District, walls had been retrofitted with humidity membranes to mimic underwater pressure gradients as much as limited resources allowed. Not enough. Some arrivals stepped out into corridors that felt too dry, too thin. Volunteers from the Soulborn Solidarity Network scrambled to adjust environmental controls and dig water reclamation systems out of crates. In New Recife Arcology, Mayor Camila Duarte walked blocks that had, a month prior, been slated for demolition. Now they were crammed with modular units, stacked 6 high, connected by bridges that looked improvised because they were. "We're going to break our transit grid," one of her advisors warned, as yet another bus route was diverted to accommodate new population clusters. "We'll build a new one," Camila shot back, though she could already feel the edges of her patience fraying. "And if it collapses, we'll build that again." Her worry was not abstract. She watched both human and alien residents jostling in markets, strained supply chains showing in empty shelves. She read reports of heat complaints, water rationing, power flickers. For every story of a human family welcoming Rillan students into spare rooms, there was another of noise complaints, of streets more crowded than anyone had planned. On the Tethys ring, Nyla spent more time on trams between sectors than in her own assigned office, putting out fires both metaphorical and literal. Integration consultants from a dozen disciplines argued over best practices in conference rooms as, outside those rooms, reality laughed at their flowcharts. "You can't put species with different circadian cycles in the same dormitory block," one housing specialist insisted during a meeting. "Tell that to the block that already did it," Nyla said. "They're solving it by rotating quiet hours and handing out earplugs. It's messy. It's not apocalypse. This scale was never tested," another objected. "Everything we're doing has never been tested," Nyla replied, "including leaving them on stations at 160% capacity. Guess which one is more likely to kill them?" Sahar's days blurred into a stream of orientation sessions, technical crisis response meetings, and impromptu tutoring in corridors. She was assigned as faculty liaison and student mentor for a cohort that included young Rillan engineers, a few older ones, and a smattering of other species from the corridor. Velru, claws wrapped around a stylus, sat in on introductory engineering labs as if they were novice again. The scholar's mind, honed on different principles, watched humans encourage failure in ways that still shocked. In a lab where groups were tasked with rapidly prototyping a water filtration device from scavenged parts, one human student cheered when their prototype leaked spectacularly, soaking the bench. "Perfect," the human exclaimed. "Now we know where it doesn't work." In Rylan education culture, mistakes of that magnitude had been treated as shameful. Velru's gills fluttered in confusion and intrigue as Sahar guided the class through post-mortem analysis. Here, error was a data point, not an indictment. At night, whatever night meant in a ring that obeyed artificial cycles, Velru sat alone in a borrowed room, thinking of how many students they had lost when their universities were bombarded, and wondered what would have changed if failure had been held as lightly back home. Meanwhile, Rajiv watched the numbers. The Atlas protocol consumed streams of data: arrival logs, classroom attendance, resource consumption, conflict reports. It generated suggestions. Move this cohort to a quieter sector. Pair that student with this human mentor. Route extra supplies to New Recief's Block 19 before the weekend festival. Rajiv's models had predicted chaos. The reality was untidy, but the chaos was not of the kind that tore societies apart. It was the friction of too many cultures learning one another's jokes. There were fights. Yes. A Rillan student misunderstood a human's teasing and lashed out, sending both to the medbay. A human landlord tried to double-charge alien tenants and was shamed across the network when the Solborn Solidarity Network broadcast the attempt. Rumors of special treatment and hidden agendas flickered on various feeds, but there were also scenes the metrics had not fully captured. A human music class reconfigured itself into a mixed-species improvisation circle where instruments were hacked to produce tones that translated across auditory ranges. Children from multiple planets created new games in Tethys's spinning parks, rules negotiated in pantomime and fragmentary trade tongues. New Recief skyline shifted as Rillan architectural ideas seeped upward. Vertical wetlands clung to tower sides, designed by teams that paired human urban planners with Rillan practitioners of old aquatic cultivation. All of it received commentary from beyond Earth's skies. Zhakari outlets ran montages of the most jarring images. Street markets packed beyond safe capacity, strange rituals in public squares, clips of arguments labeled as riots. They added ominous soundtracks, red flashing overlays, words like contagion and collapse in their languages. On worlds that had already preferred caution over compassion, these feeds hardened attitudes. See, some said, Earth is turning itself into a laboratory, and the rest of us will be subjects when their experiments fail. On other planets, especially those with their own histories of exclusion, the feeds landed differently. They're making mistakes, a young activist on a mid-tier world told a friend, watching footage of mixed-species protests demanding better transit access in New Recife. But at least they're doing something. We locked our gates and called it prudence. As the debate sharpened, Seravel Station's metrics took a nosedive. The station had never been designed to be permanent. Life support systems needed regular overhaul, their original manufacturers long bankrupt or worse. Power grids had been patched and repatched, until engineers joked that the only thing holding them together was habit. Engineers on the ground had warned both the Assembly and regional authorities for years. Their reports had been filed, acknowledged, and mostly left unaddressed. Now, traffic from the Panstellar Exchange Initiative strained docking schedules. Shuttles arrived to pick up newly accepted students. Supply ships brought materials for new habitats. Inspection vessels from the Aurelic Assembly's review board docked, their officials clutching checklists. On a day that began with little to distinguish it from hundreds of others, a power relay cluster failed near Dock 3. The lights flickered in one section of the station, then snapped back. Monitors logged a minor anomaly. Someone wrote a ticket. Life went on. 20 minutes later, a different relay failed in another sector. Life support warnings chirped and shut off. Recalibrating. Someone else wrote another ticket. Patterns began to form. Invisible at first. Subtle correlations. The relays in question served docks scheduled to handle Panstellar Exchange Initiative traffic that day, or adjacent corridors where assembly monitors had requested tours. The GCS Lysander Pact, a sleek, imposing vessel carrying peacekeepers and inspectors, hung near Seravel Station like a shark accompanying a trawler. Officially, its purpose was oversight and security. Inside a cramped command room on the ISS Dauntless Horizon, Tomasz Wrona hunched over a holomap of the station's systems, eyelids heavy but attention sharp. "We've got 3 separate failures in 2 hours," the station's chief engineer said through a choppy link. "Everything's old, Commander. You can't blame entropy for picking favorites. Entropy doesn't read docking schedules, Wrona said. Show me the sequencing again. As the engineer replayed the logs, Wrona's mental habits, trained over decades of seeing patterns in battle chaos, clicked into place. The failures were not random. They were coordinated just enough to force attention without triggering automatic shutdowns. Who has access to the override channels hitting those relays? He asked. The answer was terse. Station engineering, assembly inspectors with full audit credentials, and anyone with diplomatic priority channels docked at high-clearance ports. Wrona's gaze drifted to the icon representing the GCS Lysander Pact. Keep that to yourself for now, he said. We need proof. The next failure gave them that proof and nearly killed thousands. An hour into the Lysander Pact's scheduled compliance tour of the station, Dock 1's gravity generators hiccuped. Docking clamps faltered. A bulk carrier half the size of a city slipped in its cradle. Velocity and mass conspired. If the carrier broke free, it would slam into the station's outer shell, puncturing sections where tens of thousands lived. Alarm klaxons screamed into every language at once. In the control room, station personnel scrambled. Automated systems fought to re-engage clamps, but something in the chain refused the commands. The error messages read like Sabotage. On the dauntless horizon, Wrona did not wait for clearance. Helm, bring us in, he ordered. Emergency intercept. We're going to brace her. You want to dock with a falling ship? The helmswoman blurted. We're going to let inertia do our work, Wrona said. Lateral thrusters only. We match the vector, nudge just enough to keep it aligned with the station. If we can hold her there for even 5 minutes, that gives engineering time to reroute. It was insane. It was also the only option he could see that did not involve watching a station become shrapnel. Engines fired. The dauntless horizon swung in, hull juddering as gravity fields clashed. The carrier loomed, its sheer bulk blotting out stars. On Tethys' habitat ring, half a system away, Sahar's wristband lit red with an alert from Atlas. She saw a summarized nightmare. Seravel Station. Life support at risk. Load curves spiking. Failure projections cascading. The protocol pushed a challenge to all registered engineering cohorts. Seravel Station Emergency Stabilization Request for Distributed Design Assistance. Within minutes, labs across Earth and Tethys, filled with blinking icons. Sahar burst into one of the engineering classrooms where Velru and their cohort were working through assignment problems that suddenly felt irrelevant. Drop it, she said. We have a live station trying to shake itself apart. Atlas is spinning up a design tournament. You're in. The room snapped to focus. Screens flooded with schematics. Seravel's fragmented blueprints, incomplete but enough to suggest workarounds, appeared alongside data from Wrona's ship. We can't control systems from here, one student said, fingers already flying over input pads. We don't need direct control, Sahar answered. We feed solutions to the teams on site. They're drowning in problems. We give them options. Think modular. Think plug and play. Think quick. Velru's scholar brain shifted gears. The Rillan had studied infrastructure failures in the corridor as part of historical work on collapse. Now, that knowledge met human design aggression. Reroute life support controls through auxiliary channels never intended for that purpose, Velru suggested. Redefine sensor input as command input. In old stations, maintenance interfaces often ran on separate networks. Like using an obsolete chat port as a steering wheel, Sahar said, half laughing. Yes, show me where. Teams across Earth and Tethys hit similar insights. Someone in New Receif's coastal engineering class realized they could stabilize a failing rotational module by timing microthrusts to the structure's natural flex frequency, like pushing a swing at the right moment. A Tethys-based robotics club proposed sending repair drones along exterior trusses with preloaded patch routines. Atlas ingested every viable design, ranked them, pushed the top candidates to Seravel's beleaguered engineers within minutes of their conception. Back at the station, as the dauntless horizon locked magnetic clamps onto the bulk carrier's flank and fired its thrusters against the drift, the chief engineer's board lit up with guidance. Who is sending this? The engineer demanded, scanning a list of sender IDs that read like a school roll call. Earth, Wrona said through gritted teeth as G-forces tugged at his frame. And everyone they infected with their bad habits. The engineer did not have the luxury of argument. Root life support override through maintenance chat ports? Someone at their shoulder exclaimed. That's mad. Mad and correct, the engineer snapped. Do it. Commands flew. The patched-together workaround seized control of failing systems, forcing them to accept stabilization routines. Minutes stretched thick. The bulk carrier groaned under conflicting forces. The station vibrated like a plucked string. In classrooms and labs across Earth, students watched live feeds with hearts hammering. Velru felt phantom shakes in their fingertips, as though the station's tremors traveled through the networks. Then, slowly, vectors aligned. The carrier settled back into its cradle. Emergency clamps locked with a final, reassuring thud. On board the dauntless Horizon, Wrona sagged against his chair, sweat beading on his forehead. Status, he croaked. Station integrity nominal, came the answer. We did it, Commander. You did it, he corrected. We'll argue about allocation of glory later. The crisis did not end there. Follow-up failures cascaded, but now with a global cohort of problem solvers hammering at them, each one was met with countermeasures born from 1,000 sleepless minds. The networks carried more than schematics. They carried images of humans and aliens alike, hunched over terminals, working together. They carried breathless reactions from Seravel residents who had felt the station shudder and then subside. They carried, too, evidence that the disaster had not been an accident. Atlas's analytics, chewing through gigabytes of traffic logs, noticed anomalies. Command packets routed through diplomatic channels that should have been idle, timing clusters too coincidental to be chance. Rajiv, staring at the patterns, felt a cold clarity. These aren't random hardware faults, he said to Wrona, patching through from Tethys. Look at the origin points. High-priority channels, encrypted with assembly liaison codes, and these, here, tagged to Zhakari diplomatic identifiers. Wrona studied the proof. It made a hideous kind of sense. The Zhakari had the most to gain from proving Earth's program dangerous. A failing station at a critical transit node would have fit their narrative perfectly, especially if they could link it to exchange traffic. Direct accusation would be messy. The Assembly would be inclined to see any human claim of sabotage as deflection. Send it to Envoy Lurith, Wrona said, and to Speaker Janur's secure line. Quietly. Strip out any signatures that scream Earth. Let the data speak before anyone can accuse us of tampering. As the logs traveled, Prefect Maljour moved to capitalize on the public part of the crisis. In the days that followed, Zhakari representatives filled assembly channels with condemnations. They broadcast heavily edited clips of panicked Seravel residents, framing the incident as the inevitable outcome of Earth's reckless ambition. They turned a fragile hub into a testbed, Maljour argued in a remote session. If the dauntless Horizon had slipped by a fraction, we would be counting bodies. This is precisely why we needed to limit their influence. When Maljour drafted a new amendment to the Refugee Resettlement Accord, it was sweeping. It declared that any large-scale movement of displaced populations, for any reason, study, labor, cultural exchange, should be counted as refugee relocation for the purposes of assembly oversight. It proposed retroactive application. If passed, Earth's 10 million students would be reclassified overnight as illegally settled refugees. The ban would become a cudgel to punish Earth's defiance. The proposal ignited a political storm. Inspection teams from the GCS Lysander Pact and other vessels filed reports, many tinged with grudging admiration for Earth's rapid response to the Seravel emergency. Their accounts sat uneasily alongside Maljour's talking points. Envoy Lurith read the sabotage evidence from Wrona and Rajiv with feathers ruffling in dismayed disbelief. A Celsorian did not like believing that a fellow assembly member would endanger civilians for political gain. Belief was not required. The logs showed patterns unmistakable to any systems analyst. Speaker Janur, too, processed the same data in long, quiet hours. The presiding officer weighed the damage of exposing Zhakari wrongdoing against the damage of letting the blame fall entirely on Earth. When the emergency session opened to debate Maljour's amendment, the chamber simmered with more than usual tension. Delegates from worlds that had cautiously supported the initial ban watched with sharpened skepticism. Others came predisposed to defend Earth's experiment, seeing it as humanity's strange merit. Still, others cared little for moral questions and more for the precedents that would be set. As the session began, Aiden Kwan stood once more at the center of a galaxy's attention. "Honored members," he said, "in recent cycles, much has been said about Earth's supposed arrogance, our alleged disregard for stability. I will not pretend we are modest. We do big, messy things. We do them too fast. We argue in public. We make art out of our arguments. Sometimes we break more than we fix." Murmurs, a mix of agreement and irritation. "But look at this," Aiden continued. Images flooded the air. Seravel Station, stabilizing under a storm of human and alien ingenuity. Rillan engineers in Tethys labs, high-fiving human classmates when simulations succeeded. A Celsorian observer shaking hands, or the nearest analog with a new Recife community leader in front of a new mixed housing block. "Our exchange participants," Aiden said, "are not a faceless influx. They are collaborators. They are designers of the fixes that saved Seravel. They are building life support modules now being installed back in the corridor. They are already, in a matter of months, turning from victims into contributors." Nyla stepped into frame, carrying datasets. "We have rigorous metrics," she said. "Compare crime rates among our exchange participants to those in camps left in limbo. Compare mental health surveys. Compare the speed at which they gain language proficiency, technical skills, civic engagement. I will not insult you by claiming perfection, but I will show you that our model has produced more stability in 6 months than some camp systems produce in 6 years. Rajiv joined, sharing Atlas's open-source repository address. "We are not hoarding this," he said. "Any world can take our tools. You hate our style? Fine. Take the code, modify it, make it quieter, more dignified, more in line with your culture. The point is not that Earth alone must carry this. The point is that freezing people in place is a slower disaster than anything we're doing." Prefect Maljour waited for his turn, fingers steepled. "Everything they show you," Maljour began when the floor opened, "is carefully curated. For every cheerful face they broadcast, there are resentments they do not show. Local workers displaced, infrastructure stretched to cracking, cultural norms eroded. And when their chaotic experiment nearly smashed Seravel Station, who bore the risk? Not them. The corridor did. Again. Incorrect, Wrona muttered under his breath aboard the dauntless Horizon, watching the feed. But the channel was one way. Maljour spread virtual folders in the air, filled with worst-case footage from Earth's streets. Skirmishes edited to look like constant riots. Overcrowded transit hubs devoid of context. "This is not integration," Maljour said. "It is destabilization with a smiling mask. We must draw a line. Any movement of displaced persons, under any label, must be counted and controlled as refugee resettlement. Otherwise, Earth, or any world seeking influence, can simply rename influxes and flood the galaxy under the guise of school enrollment." The proposal sounded tidy. It appealed to those who feared loopholes more than they feared stagnation. Then Speaker Janur summoned a different kind of testimony. "To understand whom we speak of," Janur said, "we must hear them. The floor is granted to a representative selection of participants in Earth's Exchange Initiative." Velru's image materialized alongside that of several younger Rylans and a few others from the corridor. Their backgrounds showed glimpses of Tethys labs, new Recife rooftops, improvised classrooms. "Scholars of this assembly," Velru began, inclining their head with old academic courtesy. "I stand here as someone whose own institutions are in ruins. We did not seek that ruin. It found us. When Earth came, they did not offer us pity. They offered us syllabi." There was a faint ripple of amusement at the phrasing, then curiosity, as Velru continued. "They did not tell us, 'Come, and we will feed you, while you forget who you were.' They said, 'Come, bring your memories, your methods, your songs, and we will add ours.' In the months since we arrived, I have seen my young learn to think of mistakes as data. I have seen humans learn that our oldest floodway designs, crafted for wetlands long gone, can be adapted for their coastal towers. This is not charity, it is exchange in the truest sense. A younger Rillan, one of Sahar's mentees, spoke next. Their eyes shone with a defiance born in crowded corridors and tempered in shared labs. When Seravel Station began to fail, they said, we did not wait in line for rescue. Our classmates on Earth stayed up through their night cycles, sending us designs. We tested them, sent feedback, sent more ideas. The ship that braced the falling carrier was human-built. The workaround that hijacked maintenance channels for life support was half written by a student from New Recife and half refined by a student from Rilla's last surviving polytechnic. We were not a burden. We were part of the solution. The feed showed glimpses of those sleepless sessions. Human and Rillan faces lit by screens, hands moving in different but complementary patterns. Call us refugees if you like, the young student finished. We know what we have fled, but don't tell us we are only that. On Earth, we are also problem solvers, artists, neighbors, classmates. Taking that away with a pen stroke will not make the galaxy safer. It will only make it smaller. The chamber held a silence textured with reconsideration. Into that space, Envoy Lurith stepped with the evidence Wrona and Rajiv had collected. In reviewing the Seravel incident, Lurith said, Celsorian analysts were troubled by certain anomalies. Packet traces suggested that some of the critical failures did not originate from hardware fatigue, but from deliberate override commands routed through channels that should have been secure. Holologs appeared, signal paths lighting up in colors associated with diplomatic encryption. These commands, Lurith continued, were traced to identities linked with Zhakari diplomatic presence aboard the GCS Lysander Pact. We have independently verified the signatures. They are not forgeries. Gasps and surges of static from audio feeds rippled through the chamber. Maljour's composure cracked for a moment, then reasserted itself in a different form. These so-called proofs come from Earth-linked sources, the prefect said sharply. You would trust their interpretation above ours? I would trust the math, Lurith replied. We did not rely on Earth's analysts alone. Celsorian systems specialists, with no stake in this feud, replicated their findings. And I would ask, if you feared Earth's exchange program so much, did you deem it acceptable to risk a station full of innocents to make your point? Eyes shifted in the Zhakari alcove. A few of Maljour's allies shifted metaphorical or literal feet. Speaker Janur's voice, when it came, was harder than before. The Assembly will investigate any evidence of sabotage in full, Janur said. For now, this information calls into question the narrative that the Seravel incident was an inevitable consequence of Earth's initiative. At the very least, responsibility is shared, and perhaps not equally. Maljour's proposed amendment, which had seemed on track to pass hours earlier, drunk on post-crisis fear, now looked overreaching. Sensing the opening, Aiden Kwan played the last piece prepared with Nyla, Rajiv, and others, a counterproposal. We agree that mass movements of people cannot remain ungoverned, Aiden said. We agree that labels should not become shields against accountability, so let us not close the door on exchange. Let us instead make it safer and more equitable. Holographic text blossomed. The Compact of Seravel. Under its terms, large-scale educational and cultural exchanges involving displaced populations would be codified as a distinct category. They would carry obligations. Host worlds had to meet integration standards, provide transparent metrics, share tools with others. Participants had rights to representation and governance of their programs, to pathways to permanent status or supported return. The compact proposed campus corridors anchored by stations like Seravel transformed from glorified waiting rooms into genuine educational hubs governed by mixed councils of hosts, homeworld representatives, and participant delegates. What Earth is doing, Aiden said, does not have to be an exception. It can be a pilot. We are prepared to sign this compact and be judged by it. We invite you to join us. If you dislike how we do it, write better clauses. Build your own exchange hubs. But do not pretend that pushing people into holding patterns is neutral. It is a choice, and it has consequences. Debate raged. Delegates who had once walked in lockstep with the Zhakari bloc found themselves uneasy at the sabotage revelations. Worlds that had watched Seravel nearly fall and then be caught by a ship crewed by humans and allies found it harder to argue that Earth's values were purely destructive. Some clung to their fear. If we normalize mass exchange, we normalize constant flux, a cautious delegate argued. Stability requires boundaries. Others, especially those whose own histories had taught them how brittle forced stability could be, spoke for the compact. We are made of flux, a representative from a zone that had survived a supernova-driven evacuation remarked. We survived because one world, then many, broke their own neat categories long enough to let us in. If Earth wants to make a virtue of what the rest of us did reluctantly, perhaps we should let them, and watch closely. When it came time to vote, Speaker Janur's hand did not tremble, but Janur's heart did. The tally arrived slower than usual, not because the system lagged, but because several delegations changed their votes mid-process, swayed by arguments, or by the changing political winds after the Sabotage revelations. The Compact of Seravel passed by a margin slim enough to leave everyone alert. The emergency ban that had shackled Earth's resettlement efforts was not simply repealed, it was reframed. Under the Compact, Earth became the first designated primary education hub for the Seravel Corridor, subject to oversight but also protected in its right to host exchange participants. Prefect Maljour's amendment, the one that would have retroactively criminalized Earth's students, was shelved, then quietly doomed as investigations into Zhakari channels began. In Seravel Station's central hall, word arrived in the form of updated regulation snippets that scrolled past on public displays, confusing most who saw them. Their true meaning took form as transports continued to arrive, not slowed by new red tape. In New Recife and on the Tethys Ring, the immediate effect was simpler. The work they were already doing no longer hung quite so precariously over a legal abyss. On Tethys, in a shared lab that smelled of solder and saline, Sahar and Velru stood before a bank of monitors, replaying moments from the assembly session. "They almost shut us down," Sahar said softly. "All of this, months of effort, and a single vote could have turned it all into a crime." Velru watched their own image, speaking into the assembly chamber from a station thousands of light-years away. "We still stand on thin ice," the scholar replied. "But it is ice we chose to step onto, instead of being pushed onto. That is different." Sahar thought of the children pressed to the observation glass on Seravel Station, their questions about Earth. She thought of the way her own classmates in New Recife had once spoken about off-worlders as a distant, unreal concept. Now those off-worlders were right here, in her labs, in the elevators, in the cafes. "Do you regret coming?" she asked. Velru's gills fluttered.
"I regret many things,"
they said.
"Not coming here is not among them."
Far below, in New Recife's bustling streets, Mayor Camila Duarte leaned on a balcony railing, looking out over towers inset with shining bands of vertical wetlands designed in workshops where Rillan and human engineers had traded swearing in each other's languages. Her city's budget was still stretched. Transit remained crowded. Cultural misunderstandings still flared. An easy ending was not on offer. But when she walked through the new campus districts, she saw signs that the future was no longer only reactive. Children with mixed groups of friends moved in clusters that no single language could contain. Neighborhood councils included voices that, a year earlier, would never have been offered a seat. The Solborn Solidarity Network's training sessions struggled to keep up with demand. On a broadcast beamed out from a Tethys studio, Sahar and Velru co-taught a course called Design Under Constraint, Lessons from Seravel. The class combined engineering problems with cultural analysis. Students logged in from across Earth and from stations sprinkled through the corridor. Dr. Naila Ezenwa spent more time these days advising officials from other worlds, trying to replicate or adapt Earth's integration systems. Some wanted full copies of the Atlas Protocol. Others wanted to study it just long enough to extract pieces they could stomach. Rajiv Menon, staring at code that had grown beyond any single person's direct understanding, began the long, complicated task of incorporating ethical frameworks derived from non-human philosophies into the algorithm's decision-making. It was no longer enough for Atlas to reflect Earth's values. The exchange had to be multidirectional, even in software. Aiden Kwan, Watching new cohorts of human students board ships heading for Rillan rebuilding projects and other exchange programs set up under the compact allowed himself a rare moment of stillness. Humans, once the ones always moving toward opportunities elsewhere, were now also hosts, stewards of a dangerous, beautiful thing, a planet willing to risk becoming a crossroads. Across the galaxy, mention of Earth's recent defiance provoked arguments. Some still condemned them as meddlers. Some praised them as visionaries. Some grumbled that humanity had gotten lucky and that the model would fail spectacularly in other hands. On a distant world where children studied interstellar history, a teacher told them about the time powerful worlds decided that one small planet was too willing to take in the galaxy's displaced. How those powers drew up a ban, thinking they could freeze compassion at a safe number. And then, what happened? A child asked. The teacher hesitated a heartbeat, thinking of how many details to include at this age. Then, the teacher said, the people on that planet found another door, and instead of closing it behind them, they left it open and invited everyone to argue with them about how wide it should be. The story's end was not written. Worlds would sign or reject the compact. Students would graduate or drop out. Some exchanges would succeed. Others would fail painfully. But in the dark around Seravel's wounded star, transport beacons now pulsed with a different kind of signal, not an endless red warning, but a pattern indicating routes to hubs where survival and learning had become, if not synonymous, then at least intertwined. Humanity, for all its flaws, had insisted on that intertwining. The galaxy would have to decide what to do about it, one messy semester at a time.